Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast, a podcast about stage musicals that have been legally filmed and publicly distributed. The Filmed Live Musicals website contains information on nearly 200 musicals that have been captured live. Check it out at filmedlivemusicals.com. And now, on with the show. Welcome to episode 36 of the Filmed Live Musicals podcast. I'm your host, Luisa Lyons, and my guest today is writer, teacher, and musical theater historian Margaret Hall, author of the terrific monthly musical theater history newsletter, as well as the upcoming book Gemignani, Life and Lessons from Broadway and Beyond, about musical director Paul Gemignani. Over the past 3 weeks, I have had the pleasure of taking Margaret Sondheim intensive and been in awe not only of her knowledge and passion, but her unique way of crafting a story about one of Broadway's greatest artists. Welcome, Margaret.
Hi, it's so wonderful to be here.
I am so excited to get deep down into the life of Sondheim with you today. But to start us off, what made you fall in love with musical theater?
Oh, yes. So it's one of those things where I know the story more than I have the memory. Because the day that my parents brought me home, it was Christmas Eve, 1997. My father plugged in the first VHS he had ever bought for himself with his own money, which was of The Wizard of Oz, and he held me in front of the TV so that it was the first movie he knew for sure that I had ever seen. And from there, it continued on, because that was my father's main way of sort of not babysitting me, but it was one of our main bonding activities, is we'd check out VHSs of classic musicals from the library, and we'd sit and I'd learn every single little nuance. We have incredible home videos of me, like, doing the dance from Beauty and the Beast with my father, and he starts just dancing with me as his child, and I kick him in the shin because he's not doing the choreography. And we basically... that was my childhood, and that was what I was raised on. And as an autistic person, that became my way of accessing the world. And so when I made the decision to pursue musical theater in a more serious way in middle school, the classical musicals really were my bedrock. They're my first language.
What was your dad's love? Where did his love stem from?
I'm actually not completely sure. He's about 6'2", about 300 pounds, looks like a lumberjack, and does not sing. So he was not exactly coming from, like, the performance aspect. I know that he did a single show when he was in high school. He did HMS Pinafore because they needed strong men to lift the girls. And so he was brought in to lift the girls during the dance scenes for HMS Pinafore by Gilbert and Sullivan. But he just had this fascination with it. And a big thing with both of my parents. My mother was much more involved in theater than my father was. She used to work at Kenley Players. For people who don't know what Kenley Players was, they were one of the largest regional theater touring circuits in the United States back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. John Kenley basically created stunt casting as we know it on his circuit, and my mother worked there during the summers. But with my father especially, when I think he saw the way that it made my eyes light up, he endeavored to learn as much about it as he possibly could in order to share that with me. He was a really active parent in that way.
What a beautiful gift to have given you. And I'm obsessed with this image of newborn Margaret coming home on Christmas Eve and being plunked in front of the Wizard of Oz.
And when you're picturing it, picture this massive man, and I'm this tiny baby. I was almost 2 months premature. I am itty bitty. And he's just like, it's like if you were to look at the image of Simba being held up during Circle of Life and then, like, shrink Simba by half, that's like the image of him holding me up against this, like, super staticky 90s TV, being like, look, there's colors, that's Judy Garland.
And that's something funny that I didn't know we both had in common. I'm also a preemie baby.
Oh.
I was 9 weeks early.
Oh, yeah.
So yay for the preemie baby
yes,
crowd.
We made it.
Who love musicals. We did. We made it. Oh, that's so gorgeous. And what in middle school made you decide that you wanted to pursue musical theater?
So at the beginning of middle school, I was kind of caught between two worlds. When I was in 6th grade, I thought that I was going to be a forensic anthropologist. Are you familiar with the television show Bones?
Yes.
I was going to be Bones. I come from a family where many, many people are in medicine. And from a very young age, I did not have an issue with death. I was like that weird kid who, like, wanted to stop and, like, look at the roadkill. And my grandfather, who was a very highly respected surgeon in Ohio, very much sort of like helped me form this science basis, and I very much was on my way to being a forensic anthropologist. However, I really don't like numbers. And numbers are a pretty big part of a career in science. I'm a lot more hands-on than I am numbers. And so I was having this sort of crisis of faith, I guess you could call it, in 6th grade about what I wanted to do, and I was starting to question if I wanted to be Bones or if I wanted to play Bones. And my mother had always had a subscription to the Ohio Theater out here because my great-grandfather actually helped build it. Winifred Moss was one of the plaster workers who built the Ohio Theater here in Columbus, Ohio, and he actually died from plaster inhalation while building it. And so our family always maintained a subscription to go. I know exactly the places in the theater that he worked on because he drew it out for my grandmother, Cherry. And one year, I believe it was 7th grade, Wicked was coming to the Ohio Theater. And so my mother told me that we were going, and I did not want to go. I was in like the depths of my middle school depression. I did not want to put on a dress. I did not want to put on makeup, and I did not want to go downtown. I wanted to be left with my books and being emo. But my mother forced me to go. And we were sitting in 3 rows from the back left balcony. And I have a very visceral memory, clear as day, every time I close my eyes and think about it, of sitting there, and the moment she goes up on that cherry picker at the end of Defying Gravity, losing it. Just tears pouring down my face, and turning to my mother at intermission after that song ended and telling her, "Mom, I'm gonna do that." And I have always been one of those people that once I make a decision, the decision is made. And while watching Defying Gravity, it's like the atoms in my body changed, and it was like, no, this is what you're going to do for the rest of your life, and this is going to be the only thing that will bring you this kind of fulfillment. And what that fulfillment means has changed slightly over the years, but it's always going to be musical theater. I know that in my bones. It is something that is as much a part of me as the fact that I am naturally a brunette, the fact that I'm from Ohio, the fact that my name is Margaret Cherry Hall.
That is so beautiful, and I relate just so deeply to this intense passion for musical theater, and that it is just a part of who you are.
It's as much of the language for me as English or Guelga, where it's how I see the world in a real honest way.
What's Guelga?
Oh, Guelga is, I'm slightly mispronouncing it. It's the way that my grandmother pronounced it to me when I was a kid. It's Irish.
Oh.
Spelled Gaelige. You might have heard it called Gaelic. That's Old Irish. Guelga is more of like what's spoken in what's called a Gaeltacht, which is an Irish-speaking neighborhood in Ireland.
So English, Gaela, and musical theater.
Yes, those are the languages in which I am fluent.
Well, I can share English and musical theater with you.
Yes.
So did you study performing after seeing Wicked? Did you study like singing and dance?
Primarily performance, yes. Mainly singing and acting. My rhythm skills often leave something to be desired.
Back to those numbers.
Yes, numbers, and like I swear there's a disconnect between my brain and my body where it takes like a half a second to go from my brain to my hand, but that's a bit of a difficulty when you're trying to time things. I'm also very bad at sports. But yes, I dove headfirst into performing. I attended Interlochen Center for the Arts for summer camp for 3 years. I also then worked there while I was in college, and then I went to NYU Tisch to get my degree in musical theater for my undergraduate.
Glorious. And for folks that aren't familiar, can you explain the magical place that is Interlochen?
Oh, Interlochen, land of the stately pines. Interlochen was originally founded as a sort of classical music camp for students during the 20th century. It's in the woods of northern Michigan. It's about 30-ish minutes from Traverse City, if you're familiar with where that is. You're truly in the woods, sandwiched between 2 lakes. The theater program came along later in the 20th century, and it is one of the most magical places on earth. My mom likes to describe that she knew that I was going to be okay the day we arrived there. Because I dealt with a ton of bullying when I was in school. I was the only autistic person at my school. I was the only theater kid at my school. We're in rural Ohio. Like, things happen with that regard. But the moment she dropped me off in Interlaken, she said the only thing she could think was, it's a camp full of Maggies. Where she's not alone anymore. She's surrounded by thousands of people who are this deeply invested in their art thing. And it's basically a bunch of middle schoolers and high schoolers. Now the ages have expanded to include a couple elementary schoolers, but high school is by far the largest demographic, who are there basically just to make and learn about the art form that they love for various periods. I attended the 3-week musical theater intensive program. I did the 6-week musical theater production twice. I was in Les Mis and Crazy for You. And I was also in the 1-week musical theater college audition intensive, where we prepared all of our materials for college auditions. And then when I came back as a counselor, I was a counselor for what was at the time considered high school girls. Now there are no gendered markers for housing. But when I was there, I was the head of the gender nonconforming cabins for high school girls. So non-binary and transgender women were housed in one space. And I was their counselor, and I handled a bunch of sort of theater things within that.
Wow. Okay. That is a whole other podcast that we need to set that up, because that is so many questions that I have about that.
I'm always happy to talk about the land of the stately pines.
Oh, glorious. And having myself also worked at a summer camp that is focused on creative and performing arts, where my husband describes it. We met at the summer camp, my husband and I.
Where did you go?
And but it's called Bucks Rock.
Okay.
It's a performing creative arts camp in Connecticut. And my husband describes it as a place for high functioning weirdos.
Oh, yeah. Oh, 100%.
It's exactly what you're talking about. You arrive and you find your people. Mm-hmm. You're just all other people who are passionate about theater and music and performing arts and creative arts, and you find your tribe, your people.
Yeah, no, they're family. There are people there. I'll shout out 2 people, I suppose, Allison Regan and Nick Maines, who I met in my first 3-week there when I was a sophomore, who, if and when I ever get married, they're going to be standing with me. They are some of my favorite people in the universe. I talk to Allie almost every single day. Nick is my brother. He's currently on tour with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as Augustus Gloop. Everyone should go see and support him. He's fantastic. He was Jean Valjean when we did Les Mis. But, yeah, no, the people that you meet there.
Now there's a career trajectory.
Oh, truly. He is
from Jean Valjean to Augustus Gloop.
He has a voice for the ages, and people need to write him his own star billing piece because he deserves it. He is so talented. Allie is as well. She's one of the best actors I've ever met. And those are just 2 people that I'm pulling out. I could probably give you a list of 30 names of people I went to camp with who are some of the most talented human beings I know. And we met when we were teens. And as anyone knows, the people that you know and that influence you when you were a teen live in your heart for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so true. So you went to Interlaken, you went to NYU. When did the pivot toward writing happen?
Yes. So it actually started with a pivot toward teaching, oddly enough. So when I was a junior at NYU, I noticed a couple of things that were sort of bothering me about, and it sounds rude to say bother, but it was things about my peers in terms of what they knew about going into the industry. And what bothered me is that I felt like people weren't wholly prepared. And what especially bothered me is the fact that I knew this wasn't just an NYU issue. In fact, NYU does more to teach people about musical theater history than most of the BFA programs that I know about. But it bothered me specifically when I was in a scene study class, and I've sworn to this man that I will not say his name in any public forum, but a dear, dear friend of mine who is not dumb. He is not dumb. He's actually quite smart and quite clever. Turned to me and asked if I could tell him just a little bit something about Roger Hammerstein, who he thought was one person like Irving Berlin or Stephen Sondheim. This was a man in the second semester of his 3rd year at one of the most competitive BFA programs in the country, who didn't know that Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein are 2 separate people. And this was not through a fault of his own. This was through the fact that no one had ever even told him. They just assumed he knew.
Huh.
And that was kind of the straw that broke my back, and I started teaching my friends. Where I was like, okay, everyone's coming over to Maggie's apartment. She's having a symposium. And from there, I met up with a woman named JR, who asked me to create a 7-month teaching program to teach her about the history of musical theater. She'd been working in the theater for decades and felt like she still didn't really understand the industry that she was in. And so I created my 7-month comprehensive course specifically for her, and now it's offered publicly when courses are open. They are not currently open, but when they are, I do offer it publicly. And then I really fell in love with teaching. And I fell in love with watching people get excited about the shows that had excited me for my entire life. I will never forget the first time I had a student literally yelp with joy while watching the barn dance from Seven Brides for Seven Brothers because they'd never seen it before and they didn't know what was coming. And I was like, yes, these are the things you can do with dance and with movie musicals and with all of that. And just watching people get excited makes me excited.
Did your own education come from those years of watching movie musicals with your dad?
A large part of it was from that, and also from the fact that I am autistic and special interests exist, and I think I read every single book about theater in my local library growing up. I have to know everything about something if I love it. It has to be in my bones. And, like, I'm currently reading 4 separate books about the musical theater right now, where I have to know everything. And so a lot of my education has been self-directed, as well as taking every kind of musical theater history course NYU contains. I'm sure we'll talk about this when we talk about grad school, but I took every single musical theater history course that was offered at NYU while I was an undergraduate, and I wasn't able to get a minor because the minor did not exist. And so partially out of spite and partially out of the fact that I wanted to do this, I created my own master's in musical theater history by saying, okay, well then I'll just make my own degree, and I'm declaring it before I take all the classes so you can't say it doesn't exist. And so now I'm in the middle of doing that. But your initial question of how we get to the writing happens before that, kind of. There's a woman named Jennifer Ashley Tepper, who you might be aware of, your readers might be, not readers, your listeners might be aware of. But for those of you
Broadway
who are not aware,
historian.
Yes, Jennifer is truly a trailblazer for musical theater historians. She's changed the game, and she went to NYU. And I've actually known her very loosely on Facebook for almost a decade, which is insane to think about. It was from back in those days where you would friend people on Facebook just because you wanted to get to know them, where you didn't just like friend your friends, it was like exploratory friending. And so we had become friends while Smash was airing, actually. Wild enough, just because I wanted someone to talk to about Smash, and she always posted about Smash. I never was gutsy enough to talk to her. I don't think she actually remembers this. I only talked to her one time before the next time I'm about to talk to you about, which was at the bombshell performance at the Minskoff Theater that Smash did. And I saw her, like, in the lobby, and I went up to her and I was just like, hi, I'm Maggie Hall, we're friends on Facebook, and just, like, was, like, a stressed out 16-year-old. I really don't think Jen remembers that, but that was technically, we had met before this incident. But after I started teaching, and I thought that maybe making this master's was going to be a good thing for me, I had emailed her and asked if I could come and talk to her about it. Because Jen went to NYU, and so I wanted to see if she had tried to do something like this, and if the admin had shut her down, and also just like, hey, you kind of do the thing I'm doing, and help me, please. A sort of two-handed meeting. And so she took the meeting with me, because she's an incredibly generous and lovely human being. We talked for a while and realized that our brains are on, like, the same wavelength. And then the pandemic hit. We had that meeting in February of 2020. And we all know what happened in March of 2020. I applied to my master's. It's at NYU Gallatin, which is a program where NYU lets you create your own degree. I got in, thankfully. But I knew I didn't want to start it immediately in the pandemic because I need research materials for what I'm doing. Specifically, I need the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. And the library was closed for all of 2020. And so I deferred my enrollment for a year and didn't really know what I was going to do as I was finishing my senior year at NYU doing Zoom ballet, which was just a lovely way to end a BFA experience. When I get a phone call from Jen in the middle of a class, I close my laptop because Jen had never called me before. So I just, Zoom outage, sorry, pick up the phone. It's May 5th, 2020. And Jen tells me, hi, so I just got off the phone with Lonnie Price and Paul Gemignani. Paul's going to write a book. I think you're right for it. I'm going to have him email you. Are you okay with me giving him your email? And I said, okay. confession here, I did not know who Paul was off of just name on that phone call. I knew who Lonnie was, because I am a good disciple of Merrily We Roll Along. But Paul's name was one where I'm like, I know I should know that name. Like, I know I've read that name, but a face doesn't come to mind when you say that. But I said, yes, go. And what I thought she was doing, actually, was that he wanted to see if a young person would be interested in reading this book. Because a big part of Jen and I's conversation that we'd had in February was me talking about how many theater books I read. And so I had thought that my job was going to be to email him back and sort of explain why I, a young person, would be interested in reading his memoir. And so I just very quickly read through Paul's Wikipedia page as a reminder of who he was to myself, sort of jogged my memory a bit, looked at some photos. For those of you who aren't familiar with Paul Gemignani, he's a big burly bear of a man who wears tinted glasses and looks like a mafioso, but is in reality a teddy bear. And Paul sent me an email basically saying, Lonnie Price has bullied me into trying to do this book. Explain to me why you think this should exist. And so I sent back like a 3-paragraph thing being like, here's all the reasons I'd want to read it and what I'd be curious about. And Paul emailed me back, great, I'll call you next week and we'll get started. And I sat with that, and I called my best friend in the universe, Zachary Agatstein, screamed for a little bit. Because at this point, I did do some of my own writing, and I was interested in maybe writing at some point. But I had thought that I wouldn't be anywhere near writing my first book until I was like 30. That was my thing. Like, the goal I'd given myself was like, okay, I get this master's, finish my master's by the time I'm like 25, 26. Then I start working on a book, and maybe it's out by the time I'm 30. And that was like my condensed mental timeline. And suddenly this was in my lap. And I had to do something that was actually taught to me by Michael Cerveris, who is someone that I respect incredibly. He's actually the reason I had the meeting with Jen, is because I had been so emotionally affected by his performance in the Next Room by Sarah Rule that I had sent him an email asking to get lunch just to talk with him about it, because that play changed the atoms that make up my body. And we had done so on, I believe, February 18th, 2020. And we ended up talking for like an hour and a half. And that meeting went so well that I then scheduled the meeting with Jen. So the meeting with Jen would not have happened if I had not had the meeting with Michael. And one of the things that Michael had told me while we were having that lunch was that you need to do what scares you. And that if you feel safe in what you're doing, you're not actually going after anything. You're not risking anything, and risk is what you have to do to change. And so I sort of sat with that terror of the perspective of writing this book and having never written a book like this. And also, like, no one knows I even really work in the musical theater history industry. No one knew me but Jen at this point. I don't have a public Twitter at this point. I don't have a website. I've never published anything online except I was the social media manager for the NYU Tisch program for a week. But I decided to just sort of give myself over to the fear and say, okay, I'm scared. Let's do it while scared. And Paul has this magical quality about him, and I am not the only person he has done this to. In fact, I am one of thousands that I've spoken to that he has done this. He knows who people are supposed to be before they know. It's one of 2 superpowers I believe he has. He knows who you're supposed to be, and he can see 3 seconds into the future. And Paul metaphorically looked at me through the phone when we had our first phone call, and he saw the person I was supposed to become. And while I sort of recorded his life story, he took me down that path. I like to say that between him and Jen Tepper, he Merrilied me, which is that he took a young person at the beginning of their career and showed them what the last page was going to look like before they got there. He's the most incredible person, and we ended up writing the book in complete secrecy with no one knowing that this was going on in 6 months. We talked every single day, and I really became like one with his mind for half of a year. We started writing in earnest in August, and I turned it in on January 15th. I interviewed nearly 100 of his closest colleagues who kept it incredibly close to their chest. And I slowly started, like, I guess coming out would probably be the right term, but like coming out in like the old school social term of things of like, I made a public Twitter account and I made a website and I just started sort of slowly talking online. And then the bomb dropped in October of 2020, right before I turned in the book, to say like, oh, this book's coming. And by the way, it's written by this person nobody's heard of. And then ever since that day, it's just been this crazy roller coaster.
That is such an extraordinary story. And I'm so glad that you said that you feel like Paul Merrilead you. Because exactly as you were talking, I was like, this is the plot of Merrily We Roll Along.
Oh, you do not want to know how many times I listened to Opening Doors while writing.
Yeah.
Where it's one of those things,
I
like,
can
it doesn't
hear it,
happen.
I can see it.
It does not happen anymore. And it's one of those things where if I think about it for too long, I will start crying. People do not get plucked out of nowhere in any industry anymore. It's a fairy tale. It's something that doesn't happen, and yet it happened to me. And not only did it happen to me, it happened to me in the middle of a pandemic.
Because you had done all the work.
Ugh. Well, thank you. But I think a lot of it is also the fact that Paul is an incredibly generous human.
You had, yes, that too, but you had done the work and you were ready when the opportunity came and you said yes to that opportunity.
Yes.
And that's incredibly special, which leads me to my next question. Where does Sondheim fit in?
Ah, Steve. So he obviously fits in with Gemignani. But to go back to sort of the start of Sondheim's influence on my life, it's a lot more convoluted and hard to pin down. I cannot tell you the first time I knew the name Stephen Sondheim. But I can tell you the first cast recording of his shows that I fell in love with. Do you remember the good old days of LimeWire?
I sure do.
Yes.
And Napster?
Oh, yes. So on LimeWire, if you searched Broadway cast recording in the year 2008, the first show that came up, because Alphabetical exists, was the 2004 Assassins cast recording. And I had decided that I wanted to expand my horizons beyond the shows that I knew, because the only shows I knew were the ones that were sort of the really beat-up librettos in my local library, and I wanted to know more. And so I downloaded every single cast recording that started with the letter A that was on LimeWire. And the first one was Assassins, and so I started there. And it hit me like a train. And I was immediately just deeply in love with this show. You do not want to know how much time I spent listening to Unworthy of Your Love while being an emotional middle schooler.
Just very quickly, alphabetically, anyone can whistle should have been first.
Well, probably, but it might not have even been on there. It's just like, who uploaded things to this file sharing website? That just happened to be the first.
Yes.
And I'm grateful it was the first, because Assassins remains to this day my favorite musical of all time. I think it's a near perfect thing. And as Steve stated himself in his books, it was by far the closest to his actual image of what he wanted the show to be. It's the closest there ever was to a perfect Sondheim show in terms of capturing his intention. And I think that's all over it. But so Steve basically was Assassins to me until, like, high school, which is when I started sort of, like, learning the material. Specifically, I got, like, into Sweeney Todd for a bit, all that fun stuff. But I was never the big Sondheim kid. How, if you're at, like, a musical theater camp, there's always the one they're the Sondheim kid. Like, that is their identity, is the Sondheim person.
So you weren't watching, like, the PBS Into the Woods or even Sweeney, the Angela Lansbury?
I might have seen them in passing, but I wasn't obsessing over them. There were two things that I was obsessing over mainly in high school. That was Elaine Stritch, who was and remains... I feel like everyone has their diva. People sort of think of it being like, are you a Bernadette person or a Patty person? I think there's many divas to choose from, and Elaine is mine. This is not for this podcast, but at some point I will share with you the story of when I found out that Elaine Stritch had died, because literally Interlaken stopped moving. Everyone shut down to be like, is Maggie okay? Because it was a whole thing. but it was Elaine, and it was Rodgers and Hammerstein. Rodgers and Hammerstein were really where I was putting a lot of eggs in my basket. But I had a voice teacher named Harriet Rollins Hill who gave me the song God That's Good to learn for an audition for something in high school. I forget what it was at this point. And that was the first Sondheim piece I ever learned. And then after that, I learned The Miller's Son. I was the most bold 15-year-old Miller's Son you've ever seen. And I did it for an audition for a company that was doing Into the Woods in rural Ohio. I ended up not doing the show, but I did book it. I have not sung Miller's Son since, and I feel like I need to, just to like reclaim the fact that I am now not 15 singing that song. But when it really got real for me, in terms of like examining Steve in more than a surface level kind of way, was in college. And it was again my junior year. My junior year, and this is something I forgot to mention, sort of the history path of things, I interned at the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization. As a part of Concord Theatrical's internship program, I was their archival intern for a semester. And I worked a lot on sort of, primarily on Oscar Hammerstein, a little bit on Irving Berlin, and then some on Rodgers, but mostly on sort of cataloging information about Oscar Hammerstein, who obviously is connected to Steve. And at the same time I was working that internship, I was taking the Sondheim Scene into Song class with a woman named Jen Waldman, who is an incredible human being and who truly lit this fire of fascination for Steve's work. Because we would sit there at the table. I was that annoying kid who sits directly next to the teacher. And we would just sit there and just talk about all of like the intricacies and the layers of what was going on. And she really lit that fire so that then when I started working with Paul, again, like you were saying, I kind of had, without knowing it, was training for this to come. Paul taught me so much about Steve, both because he knew things that other people just can't know because they do not know him, but also Paul's an incredible teacher. And he basically, so I cannot play any instruments. I don't have the hand-eye coordination for it, but he taught me how to think like a Sondheim musician. And then sort of the almighty event happened while working on Gemignani, which is that I got to speak with the man himself a couple of times. And I talk about this a bit in my reflection of Steve that I wrote after he passed away. He was simultaneously exactly what you think he's going to be and nothing like what you think he's going to be. Because he's a man, he's not a god. And I learned more about what success means, what fame means, what loyalty, what friendship, what being an artist means, just from existing with Steve when we would speak. Even without, it wasn't even necessarily about the words he would say. It was just like his presence communicated things. And so my relationship with Steve, it's always interesting because I spend so much time talking with Sondheimites, which is the term that's sort of used for mega Sondheim fans. I wasn't necessarily that when I first met with Steve. I really loved the work, but I wasn't like, there are some people who like know like the names of every dog he's ever had and stuff like that. I was like that with other people, but not with Steve. And so on some level, once I got over myself, I was able to approach him as a human. And so I'm in this interesting place now where I both teach about his art, which is inherently talking about sort of Steve the brand, while also feeling like on some level I have a knowledge of the man, which is something we've talked about in the 3-week course, is different than knowing Steve is different from knowing Stephen Sondheim. Put it that way. And I'm also not presumptuous enough to think that I really knew Steve. There are people that were in the inner circle. I think of Steve's like groups like an onion. I was lucky enough that in his lifetime I breached the first layer of the onion. There are people that were many layers closer, but I am incredibly grateful to have had the experience as I had knowing him on that outer circle.
So speaking of Stephen Sondheim as a person, since Sondheim's passing in November 2021, there's been a lot of coverage about his life, and there are plenty of resources out there to learn more about his biography. But today we're going to give an overview of Filmed Live Sondheim musicals. Sondheim has more entries in the database than any other composer, including Candide, Company, Follies, Gypsy, Into the Woods, Merrily We Roll Along, Pacific Overtures, Passion, Putting It Together, Sunday in the Park with George, and Sweeney Todd. So let's dive in. We're going to go alphabetically. So I just want to touch on Candide. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Can you talk us through Sondheim's relationship with Candide?
Yes. So Candide, as it stands, if you're like at the Copyright Office, is a Leonard Bernstein production. It's Leonard Bernstein's comic opera that's also incredibly tragic if you dig into it. In 1974, however, they decided to do a revival of Candide, and Leonard Bernstein wanted to punch it up. This is after he's done West Side Story with Stephen, and so he calls Steve and asks him to sort of rewrite some lyrics here and there, pull a few things together. So while it technically has Steve's name on it in places, he's much more of a contributor than he is a creative. The show exists already. He's just rewording a couple of things here and there. It's more of a favor to a friend than anything else. And it also helps that Hal Prince was directing that production of Candide. So it was really him helping out two friends at the same time.
The 1974 production?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And so then subsequent productions, 4 of which are in the database, the 1986 New York City Opera, 1988 Scottish Opera, 1989 Barbican Theatre production, which was conducted by Bernstein and is like considered because recording. He conducted it right before he died. It's considered the definitive Candide, and then the 2004 Lincoln Center concert.
Yes.
And there's information about all of those in the database.
They all utilize Steve's little tweaks here and there. It's now become the only licensable version.
Ah, interesting. So let's jump to Company.
Company. Now, Company is an interesting one because it's both one of Steve's first shows of his own merit, but it's also one of his later recordings, which I always find really intriguing. The one I always look at is the 2011, because it's really a concert recording more than it is a pro shot, in my opinion. There's some people who bicker with me because Company itself is kind of a concert staging as a show. But to me, if you're putting the orchestra behind the actors, it automatically becomes a concert recording unless it's cabaret. What are your thoughts on sort of how Company transfers to screen?
That's interesting. So I know of 3 different pro shots. The 2011, which is what inspired this website, Filmed Live Musicals, and we will be doing a special episode dedicated to that production of Company.
Oh, yeah.
There's the 2007 Broadway production, the Actor Muso
the John Doyle.
With Raul Esparza. That was my first introduction to Company, was
Nice.
that production. And then there's an earlier production directed by Sam Mendes at the Donmar Warehouse from 96 with Adrian Lester as Bubby. So it's interesting because all those 3 productions take very different approaches. Yeah. And so I think it's interesting what you were saying, that it's like a concert show in the way that it's written.
It's because it straddles the line between review and concept musical. And I have my feelings about the term concept musical, but for the sake of this podcast, I will deign to use it. It has a lot of that review format in it. And that lends itself really well to a camera-like staging because it almost tells you where the close-ups should be and things like that. Like, just looking at the song Little Things You Do Together, like, it tells you when to zoom in on Joanne. It's communicating with you how to do it. And it's a really good example of how Hal Prince and the Prince and Sondheim shows especially were directed cinematically on stage. And it's why those productions film well, is because he thinks like a film director, even though Hal himself could not direct film for the life of him.
And it's interesting, I think, when you say that Lonnie Price is a name that comes up over and over again when we're talking about filmed Sondheim musicals, because he is that rare person who can do both film or stage on film and stage direction.
I adore Lonnie Price. I honestly think people talk a lot about sort of like who are the artistic antecedents of Sondheim, who are the offshoots that will come to blossom. Lonnie Price, I think, is Hal's. There's a lot of directors who've been extremely influenced by Hal, but I think Lonnie is the person who really picked up the energy of experimentation that Hal had. And in the way that Sondheim was able to pick up the idea of the quote-unquote concept musical from Oscar Hammerstein and bring it to fruition for his mentor, I feel like in a lot of ways Lonnie Price picked up the idea of filmed theater. Not films and not theater, but the hybrid of filmed theater, and brought it to fruition. I feel like he really found that place where Hal occasionally found the corner, but also sometimes turned the wrong way. Lonnie learned from those lessons and created this incredible oeuvre.
Before we go on, I think we should talk about Hal Prince and we're going to dive into Pacific Overtures on the next episode, but I think let's talk about, how Hal felt filming theater was important and his kind of influence in this sphere.
So there's two halves to this conversation. One is the professional and one is the personal. Before Pacific Overtures was filmed, which is technically the first Sondheim pro shot, he had made a film adaptation of A Little Night Music starring Elizabeth Taylor as Desiree. She's actually not a bad Desiree by any means, but the film is a mess. Everyone thought that Hal was going to be able to make the jump to film pretty easily because of how he directed theater. And people assume, like, oh, yeah, well, of course, this guy, if he uses these film techniques on stage, he should be able to use film techniques in film. But he couldn't quite jump that divide. And so the film has incredibly huge pacing issues. There's a number of scenes where it's just like a camera just sits there for like 15 minutes for a long shot where there does not need to be a long shot. It's like a dialogue scene. And it just does not work. And he was very aware that it was not working. And he was in the middle of making this film in Vienna, while Pacific Overtures is having this incredibly successful run in San Francisco. Pacific Overtures was not a hit in New York. People didn't know how to approach the music, and we'll talk more about that in the next episode. But in San Francisco, it was a smash, and there was something happening called cultural tourism, which is that people from Japan were traveling to California to see Pacific Overtures. And so when the Japanese government approached Hal about wanting to make a film of Pacific Overtures to broadcast, he was so anti-making another movie that he decided to do this filmed pro-shot motif, which then catches on like wildfire in a lot of ways. The more personal aspect of it is that Hal Prince had a connection with a woman named Betty Corwin. Betty Corwin was the founder of the Theater on Film and Tape Archive at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. She was a genius, and every single one of us who loves the musical theater, the theater in general, loves the preservation of this ephemeral art form, should thank her every morning when we wake up. Because she is the person who put in the groundwork to make these unions agree to any variation of this. She pretty much single-handedly brought 14 groups together.
Yes, literally years of work that she tirelessly campaigning unpaid to create this archive. And, when we think about how much resistance there is still to filming live theater, like think 40 years ago, how much resistance she faced to create this incredible archive.
Absolutely. And Hal was one of the first directors to really say okay to her. Because the big problem that happened for a while with Toft is people were okay with it being recorded if it was like a Shakespeare adaptation. If they felt like the text and like the idea of the show was like fully public domain, they'd be slightly more okay with that existing. The Olivier films existed. They didn't feel as precious about it because the text was out there. But new shows? No. Their directors, their casts, their composers, because they thought that the only way they were going to ever make money off of their shows, even if people couldn't come to see it on Broadway, you need to sell the cast recording, you need to take it on tour. those were the two ways that you had continued income streams. And they thought that if it was recorded, then people would just come and see the recording and they'll be cut off from being able to make a living. Hal Prince was one of the first people to say yes to Betty Corwin. And he says yes to Betty Corwin long before the Pacific Overture's public taping. And he says yes to her so unequivocally that other people start following suit. Because when they see that Hal Prince's career is not in the gutter, even though he said yes to this, then maybe all of their sort of Chicken Little, the earth is falling thought process doesn't hold up. And he ends up donating a huge amount of money to the Toft Archive. And when Hal Prince passed away, he donated basically every single piece of his archive to the library. And it's why they're able to have things like the Hal Prince exhibit that they had back in 2019 into 2020, and then was unfortunately cut short by the pandemic, but it was an incredible exhibit. There are letters from anyone you can imagine, set models, scripts, and recordings. Almost every single show Hal Prince did after Pacific Overtures is in the archive in some way, and a lot of the shows before Pacific Overtures. Not all of them, but a number. He is, if not the most represented director, one of the most represented. Because he started even baking it into, like, discussions when he was putting a show together. Is like, everyone needs to be okay with this. Because this is going to be a part of what I do. And it extends all the way to when he does Showboat in the 1990s. Is he thought it was really important sort of to preserve and leave behind a legacy for people to look back at how this art form had evolved. And so a big part of why he did that Showboat was so that it could be the Showboat to end all Showboats, and we'll tape it and we'll record it, and then there will be a version that people can come and see when they need to know what Showboat was without having to be doing it every 5 years. Hal Prince really was this huge activist, isn't quite the right term, but he really fought for the preservation of the musical theater and treating it like something of value to be cherished and cared for.
And I wish that the present day industry could hear that message. Mm-hmm. That it's, first of all, streaming now can create an additional revenue stream. So that is, the financial part aside, but the legacy of what a production is and creating a body of work and having a record of something that is fleeting.
Mm-hmm. I'm hopping a little bit forward in our list here, but Sweeney Todd. The pro shot of Sweeney Todd completely changed Steve's life, Hal's life, everyone connected with it. Sweeney Todd would have been a semi-interesting footnote in both of their careers, if not for the pro shot. The show closed pretty quickly. It was not super well received by critics. It wasn't lambasted by any means, but people didn't really know what to do with a thriller musical. And the show itself...
But which the cast recording had given it a cult following.
Yes. So it had this like underground cult following, but then when the pro shot comes out, and especially when the pro shot is shown on PBS, public access television, suddenly that is why we consider Steve to be a voice of a generation of musical theater composers, is because that pro shot inspired legions of people. I cannot tell you how many people I have interviewed in the Sondheim community over the last 3 years, and I feel comfortable saying 2/3 of those people, which is easily over 1,000 working people in this community, 2/3 of them, Sweeney Todd was their light bulb moment. Some of them, it was their light bulb moment seeing it in the theater. Someone like Michael Cerveris saw it in the back row of the, I believe, balcony when he was like 17. And that was like his moment of like, I'm going to do musical theater maybe, and not just classical theater. And then you've got everyone across the country who were able to see this pro shot who couldn't come to New York and see the show, but they could still be inspired in that way by this taping. A lot of the other tapings had similar legacies to that, but Sweeney Todd is the real big sort of explosion point of this show was almost more remembered for that taping than it is for its original production. To the point that many people to this day think that George Hearn was the original Sweeney Todd.
But he was just not just in the tour, but in inverted commas, he was in the tour production, not the Broadway.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, in case you weren't familiar, it was Len Cariou. The reason he's not in that taping is somewhat complicated, but it basically boils down to the fact that Canadian equity felt different than American equity, and so they had to tape it on tour instead of on Broadway.
Coming back to Hal Prince, the next musical in our list is Follies, which we have the concert version documentary from 1985, which has footage of the concert production.
Follies in concert, yes.
Yes, with Barbara Cook, George Hearn again, Lee Remick, Carol Burnett, Elaine Stritch, Adolph Green, and Betty Comden. Just unbelievable. Mandy Patinkin and Sondheim, of course, makes an appearance.
And don't you forget Mr. Paul Gemignani conducting up a storm.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I love the Follies in concert video. Here's another example where a show is really saved both by a concert but also by a recording. Because the original Follies didn't have a full cast recording. They didn't have enough money to record all of the songs. When they did this concert in 85, that's when they finally made a full cast recording. And when this sort of documentary was released, it gave people a way to see a little bit of this show that they kind of only just heard of. And Follies...
It's interesting to me that more shows don't do a documentary. Like it's the kind of mega hits. Like there's Hamilton has behind the scenes stuff. In the Heights had a on the road to In the Heights or something. It's surprising. I mean, I understand the costs and like the difficulty of creating a documentary, having a film crew follow you around for months on end, but it's interesting that more shows don't do that kind of marketing.
It is interesting, but I think a lot of it is to pop back to Company, and you think about Company, the making of the cast recording. Everyone is not shown in their best light at times, and people in this industry, they have a very tight leash on their image a lot of the time, especially in the 21st century when we're all hyper aware of ourselves as brands. People are very conscious of how they come across, and it can be a tight line to walk to sort of be recorded and know something is for public consumption while also being honest with your collaborators in the room. So it's a complicated thing. I'd like to see more of them, but to me that makes complete sense why people don't do it, is because they have to be sort of performing their work versus doing their work. Yeah.
Give me that nitty-gritty behind the scenes and the devastating footage of Elaine Stritch screaming into the microphone.
Oh my god. My most used GIF on my phone is a GIF of Elaine going, "I'm just screaming!" Because it fits, it does not matter the situation. Am I happy screaming? Am I angry screaming? Am I sad screaming? Does not matter. I'm screaming.
Yeah.
It's a perfect GIF.
Oh, bless Elaine.
Oh, I miss her.
And I know of two other filmed live Follies productions. There was the 2013 Opera de Toulon, where they made slight changes to the production, including having, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, so I apologize, Solange Lafitte,
yes.
played by a male actor who is well known for playing transvestite characters.
Yes.
And that one aired on French TV, and it's now available on Region 2 DVD. And then there's the most recent one, which I absolutely adore, the 2017 National Theatre production.
Oh, yeah. I love that taping. Yeah, no, London is doing a very good job of getting us complete on sort of all the shows so that eventually we will be able to watch them all in their beautiful glory.
I'm praying for the Lincoln Center transfer of My Fair Lady. They just announced the cast this week.
Harry Haddon Patton.
And I'm praying that we get a pro shot.
So good. He's so good.
And Vanessa Redgrave as I'm blanking on her character name, but yes, I'm ecstatic for that cast. So the National Theatre production, unfortunately, is not officially available. It was broadcast in cinemas. There may be some coding when I say it's not officially available, inverted commas.
Officially in single space quotes.
Yes, but we do want to say that, these things are available on YouTube, but just having the awareness that when you watch things on YouTube, that artists don't get paid when that content is uploaded.
If you have the ability to pay for something, pay for it. The only time I really sort of endorse YouTube stuff like that is when it's been made unavailable in a paid format.
And I think it speaks to the availability of content on YouTube speaks to that there is a demand for this content.
Oh my gosh, yeah. How many 1,000 strong playlists are there on YouTube of slime tutorials?
Yeah.
People want this stuff, and they're willing to pay for it, but if they can't pay for it, they're going to find some other way.
Yeah, it's absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. So let's jump ahead to Gypsy, which filmed in the West End.
And Gypsy is an interesting one to film because it's such a theater show. It's a show about making a show, but I feel like they did a really good job of filming it. I love the way they do the sweeping wide shots, and this is why I thought it was a National Theatre production, because it's filmed similarly to how the Follies taping is filmed. It's almost you'd almost think it was done on a Steadicam, and how some of the shots flow. It's filmed very cinematically, but it never loses its theatricality, which I think is really clever.
I may be misremembering this, but I think Gypsy was filmed by Broadway HD, who are the masters of cinematic.
They've done a really good job at sort of honing their craft, and I hope that they can eventually reach the point that they're sort of like the Broadway Netflix, where everything is on Broadway HD. So I think that would be a great thing. People would be willing to pay $15 a month for access to all of these. We can just get them in one place.
Mm-hmm. And the platforms, there are several now. When I started the database, there was exactly one platform for streaming theater, and now there are multiple. And I think my understanding is that the barriers that they keep coming up against is the contract agreements.
Yep.
That there's all this content out there and floating around on YouTube and, hidden away in VHS cassettes in archives and in people's basements, basically. And they can't release it because of contract agreements.
Yep, it's heartbreaking. I know of at least one musical theater historian who lives in Los Angeles who has, garages full of old celluloid that is just decaying because he can't do anything with it. Yes, Miles.
Yeah.
I make myself sick when I think about it for too long. He has recordings of the original Pal Joey with Gene Kelly. But alas.
Yeah. Oh, it makes me so, like you say, it makes me sick to my stomach because it's just in his house in LA, which is prone to fire and flood and earthquake.
Oh, no.
And it's not in temperature controlled spaces. So those tapes are very likely disintegrating.
I know. And even when we talk about digital things, because people think of the internet as being a safer preservation tool than physical. And I'm yeah, okay, it's a lot harder to arson the internet, but everything is decaying on it so fast still. Have you ever tried and looked at a website from 2008? We're not even 20 years removed from that, and it's impossible to get what you're looking for. Links die, hyperlinks fade, sites go down, servers crash. I don't know what the answer is, but none of these archives are permanent, and it breaks my heart every time we lose something.
Two things on that. Shout out to the Internet Archive, which is the most amazing resource on the planet.
Machine.
Yes. And my other thought was that there's a statistic or, a theory that we generate more content on a daily basis than we have up to the past 2,000 years of history. Mm-hmm. And it's impossible to capture it all.
It is.
And I really feel for historians and archivists.
In our hands.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So speaking of the ocean or the woods, seamless segue. let's go into the woods, which is for me was my gateway drug into film theater. Yeah. The original Broadway production, which was taped at the Martin Beck and released on television and VHS.
We love Bernadette Peters in this household. Yes, that is a very good pro shot. Interesting that the pro shot trend continued after Hal and Steve stopped working together in a public sense. But James Lapine, as director and book writer, picked up right where Hal left off. And a lot of his stuff is still preserved in that way. Something like the Act 1 pro shot, a play that he wrote. Again, sort of talking about antecedents. I don't know if something like Sunday in the Park with George or Into the Woods would have been taped if Hal hadn't been taping previously. But once that tradition is established, people continue it.
And do you know, is that connection because of PBS and shows like American Playhouse?
Oh, I'm sure part of it is that like they had contracts standing that they could easily replicate. They don't have to do all sort of the negotiation bickering. But I'm sure a big part of it is also that Steve had grown used to the idea and accustomed to it in some fashion. Because something a lot of people don't necessarily realize when we have the discussion constantly on Twitter about pro shots, producers are not the only people who are opposed to this sometimes. They're a huge hurdle. They're a massive hurdle because money is a big part of this equation. But a lot of the times it's the creatives who feel sort of shaky about their stuff being preserved in that way. It's very exposing. And it can be a really vulnerable place to be in, to have your work available at all times, and you can't go back and tweak the recording or anything like that. But by the time we get to the 80s and we get to Sunday in the Park with George specifically, Steve is in a different sort of headspace than that. And he's used to the idea of his stuff being hyperanalyzed like this. And he's also kind of been through the worst. He's been through the Merrily We Roll Along era. And it's not going to get worse than that. And so taping Sunday for PBS when they come to him, it's kind of like an okay. And then that goes quite well. And so then they tape Into the Woods, and that goes extremely well. But then the final pro shot with Lapine and Sondheim, Passion, it's a beautiful pro shot. Show does not go as well. The show itself, I think, is a really fascinating show. But if you look into how the show was initially received when it first opened, you'll see that people had a harder time stomaching it than they did Into the Woods. But if you watch the pro shots, specifically also because of the way they're filmed without an audience, which I think is interesting, they're not total live capture.
Passion, Into the Woods is filmed with an audience, right?
It's filmed with an audience, but it's multiple audiences spliced together. So you're not seeing one evening, you're seeing it like sort of piecemealed. But
which is even Sweeney was filmed that way. Yeah. That there's one quote that says like maybe 90% of that pro shot is actually filmed without the audience, and they filmed the audience for funsies to splice that in.
Think about how hard it would be to get the right angle you need on a close-up if you can't put a camera anywhere in an audience in a theater. If you're only filming from the obscure view sidelines, it's a lot harder. And so something like, think about the shot in the Sunday in the Park with George pro shot where it's like a tight close-up on Bernadette's face at the end of We Do Not Belong Together. How are you supposed to do that if you don't have a camera in the front row? Yeah. Even with digital cameras, that would be really difficult.
Which is why, like, shout out again to Broadway HD, who were able to live stream these beautifully shot productions.
Oh, the She Loves Me live stream. One of, like, I will forever remember where I was that day because it was so beautiful. And the Daddy Longlegs live stream, too. 2016 was a good year for live streaming theater. That was a good year.
I was just like kind of a few years out from my thesis at that point, and also two years out from treatment. And so I wasn't yet able to go to the theater, and it was like magical to me to have all these pro shots suddenly available.
Yes.
And again, inspired this website.
And aren't we grateful for it?
So grateful. Let's swing back to Into the Woods.
Yes.
We have the 91 Broadway pro shot, and then the 2010 Digital Theater, also shout out to Digital Theater for their amazing pro shots, of the Regent's Park open air production of Into the Woods.
One thing that I find really interesting about the Into the Woods pro shots is there's this plethora of footage of different versions of Into the Woods we can see, and they still chose to make a film with Disney. Which I think points to something that a lot of people kind of get on about pro shots about, where they're like, well, it's basically just a movie of the show, and then like, what about film rights and adaptation rights? And I'm like, well, you can still do it. Because just as people want to see a revival of Into the Woods, they want to see a different film take on Into the Woods. And it's why I think the Regent's Park version is so interesting to watch, especially if you watch it in conjunction with that original production taping of Into the Woods. It's the same music, it's the same text, but the shows and the experience you have is going to be drastically different. And if we hadn't preserved those two productions, we wouldn't know how different you can really take it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the original is like this fairy tale, medieval inspired aesthetic, whereas the open air production was like steampunk and had different framing with using the boy at the beginning. And the way I forget now how they used the narrator and the boy and the like the father coming back was intertwined differently.
Oh yeah, very differently.
Beautiful. It's one of my favorite pro shots. Also with Hannah Waddingham as the witch. Absolutely glorious.
I am so ready for her glorious return to the musical theater stage, and we will all lose it. Her speech, I think it was on the Emmys, where she talked about like hire West End actors. My hands were in the air. I was cheering so hard.
She is a queen.
Truly.
So while we're in the UK, we can jump ahead to Merrily We Roll Along for the digital theatre capture of the 2010 West End production at the Menier Chocolate Factory of Merrily We Roll Along.
What's fascinating with that is... So Merrily We Roll Along, it's a show that gets a rep for being broken. I don't think it's broken, but it has that reputation with a lot of people. And if you watch this pro shot and then immediately follow it with the documentary that Lonnie Price makes a couple of years after this pro shot comes out, and that documentary, it's on Netflix, watch it if you haven't, it's about the original Merrily. It is such an interesting dichotomy because people think of the Menier Chocolate Factory production as being like so radically different in some way from the original Broadway, but the spirit is the same. The heart of the show is the same. You can dress it up differently, but what it's trying to communicate is, if not the same, extremely similar. And I find that some of these pro shots, and we're so blessed that there are so many of these, and there are so many documentaries, I love to like do double headers with them. And like see how things evolve and how attitudes toward things evolve or don't evolve. Because that also tells you something about how a piece functions culturally.
There are not enough hours in the day to be able to consume all of this content in one sitting.
Truly. Someday I should like sit down and make like a bracket style pairing of all of like the pro shots and documentaries of like 30 days, 60 productions. Let's go.
Sondheim Marathon.
Yes.
We will need many tissues.
Oh my gosh. We will all be dehydrated.
So we're going to skip over Pacific Overtures because we're going to spend our next episode will be entirely dedicated to that gloriousness. So let's go to Passion.
Passion, yes. So as I already touched on, it's a really interesting pro shot for me. And in some ways, I enjoy the experience of watching the different Passion pro shots more than I do watching Passion live. Because I think Passion, because of the film it's based on, and because of how they filmed, the two productions that are coming to mind for me are the Donna Murphy and the Patti LuPone.
So the first one, the Donna Murphy and with Maren Maisie, was filmed by American Playhouse after the Broadway production had closed. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And it was like made for television, and that aired on PBS in 2001.
With a couple little edits
years
because
later,
it's for TV.
Right. And then in 2005, the concert version directed by Lonnie Price was filmed at the Rose Theatre at Lincoln Center.
Yes,
with Patty,
and that is Audra McDonald, Michael Cerveris,
and Michael Cerveris.
Yeah, and Patti LuPone. And then is there also, was the Judy Kuhn one recorded?
I'm not aware of it if it was, but if it was, I'm adding it to the database.
I can't remember if I've seen B-roll or if it's actual pro shot footage. It very well might have been B-roll. But Passion is a show that I think really benefits from the language of cinema. And I think part of it is because the film it comes from, Passion d'Amore, really uses the art of cinema to communicate emotion. And when you combine that with the music of Passion, I think it's extremely effective. The use of close-ups, I think, are really critical, and the way they can tell you where to look with a camera, I think, is really helpful. And also, when you have an actress like Donna Murphy, who is a class of her own, you want to see every little subtle facial twitch she's doing, because everything is a masterclass in her performance of Fosca. And as much as I love live performance, and I wish I could hop in a time machine and see her do the original production with Jer and with Marin, if you're in like the back row rush seats, you're gonna struggle to see facial detail in a way you're not when you're seeing a full cinematic capture.
Absolutely. And it's something we talked about with Traylon Doller on 2 episodes ago now on the podcast, that his first show back, he was in the cheap seats in the back in person, I should say. And he's kind of he missed being able to see the detail that he had become accustomed to after watching theater on screen during the pandemic.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I'm not going to make any predictions, because as a historian, I know that is folly. But one thing I'm comfortable saying is that the pandemic is going to have lasting effects on how all of us consume everything. It changed our relationship with just about everything around us, including human beings. And I'm going to be very intrigued to see how those shifts come to play in terms of how art is both consumed and distributed in like the next decade. Because right now I think we're still seeing people really sort of holding rank against the shift, but eventually the sand is going to shift beneath them. And I'm interested to see which way things fall.
And I think that the next generation coming through, who are going to start making theater and, eventually start making the decisions, that generation are digital natives. And it's just going to be expected that shows will be filmed and made available.
Yeah. I mean, look at Beetlejuice. Talking about a show that was able to use a digital footprint to thrive. There has been no Beetlejuice Pro Shot announced. I will be flabbergasted if one is not made. Like, something will have drastically gone wrong behind the scenes if that does not happen. Because it's such a natural fit. And I think that there's going to be a lot of people who are inspired by shows like that, who are going to be writing shows with that thought in mind. Of sort of in the way that, say, 40 years ago, the idea that your show would tour after a run in New York was sort of like a natural extension in a creative's mind. The idea that a show might be taped might become something, not in everyone's mind, but in a lot of people's minds. I could see that happening. Sort of the idea of like, okay, so we do like a Broadway production, we make a cast recording, we go on tour, we film it. They just
and getting away from this,
the Mishigas.
And getting away from this idea that the taping is the definitive, because as we see with Sondheim shows, there are multiple versions of multiple shows, and it doesn't mean that one is better or more definitive inverted commas than the other. That all of these things can exist together at the same time.
Oh, that's a huge one, because I think that's sort of what I was getting at with the vulnerable thing of people get scared of the idea of their art is frozen. Because we talk about, like, shows are frozen on opening night, but they're not really. You can still tweak things. Or even if you look at the literal Frozen, which, like, rewrote significant swaths of their show right before the pandemic. Theater is a living art form in a way that film isn't. And so I think people get really nervous when you work in this hybrid of the two, that something is going to be taken from theater by making it in a permanent-ish art form. However, as you just said, I feel like that's only a problem if you insist on there only ever being one recording. If you open the door, multiple versions can be made and multiple shifts can be made. Just as we don't consider one, like, particular production of Shakespeare to be definitive unless you're, like, a first folio purist. How many productions of Hamlet have we seen? How many productions of Macbeth? There's currently a film version of Macbeth up for Oscars, another one coming to Broadway. That doesn't mean that in, like, 60 years there's not going to be another production of Macbeth. Yeah. This idea of sort of definitive lines in the sand, again, I'm doing a lot of sand metaphors today, but we need to shake that up, because...
Are you ready to go to the beach?
Partially ready to go to the beach, partially just, like, thinking a lot about hourglasses lately. I'm not sure what the deal is, but I've been thinking a lot about the idea of physical keepers of time.
Oh, that's interesting. Speaking of time, let us move on, because we are running short of it and we have several more shows to get through. Oh gosh,
yeah, okay.
So let's jump to Putting It Together.
Putting It Together,
which was filmed at the Ethel Barrymore.
Yes, where it's both like a review type concert thing, but also a musical in its own right, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
It's a really interesting taping because, again, talk about like interpretations are different. They're doing songs that you can see in other pro shots in different show contexts, but the music still works in these different contexts that they've sort of scaffolded together.
Absolutely. And how great to have these legends, again, George Hearn, Carol Burnett, John Barrowman, Ruthie Henschel, and Bronson Pinchot. Like, how brilliant to have their work on record.
Truly.
In a show that didn't last super long.
And again, thank you to London, because putting it together does not exist without Side by Side by Sondheim, which was originally staged in London, eventually came to New York. But again, their sort of fearlessness, and I wonder if it's because of the position Shakespeare has in their cultural consciousness. If they're not as afraid of things living on in that way. I'm not going to psychoanalyze the country of England, but it's an interesting...
I would not recommend it.
Oh, God, yeah. I feel like that is one hell of a psychology thesis, but it's an interesting thing where, like, everything lines back and everything goes back. Nothing pops up out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm. It all connects. And speaking of connecting the dots, Sunday in the Park with George. Yes. I'm very proud of that transition.
That's a very good one.
So we have the original Broadway production, which was taped after the show closed. And then we have the 2013 Theatre du Châtelet production, which aired on Mezzo TV.
Yes. So the original taping of Sunday is actually my favorite of the tapings. It's like 0.001% above Pacific Overtures. They fight it out, but I've made my peace with the fact that Pacific Overtures, the taping is just a tiny bit too static, and this Sunday in the Park with George one is just, it's perfection. Everyone's at their best, and it's a show that I think really lends itself to the way they filmed it. And I think it also helps that you have Bernadette Peters and Mandy Patinkin in your lead roles who know how to work with a camera. They're not scared of it. I believe Mandy's already been Oscar nominated by this point. Bernadette was in the middle of her first film renaissance. And I think that can be something where when you watch pro shots, sometimes you can kind of question where that was the performance that everyone was talking about that year. And I think it's because sometimes performers get scared of it. But when I think they work the best is when the performers work with the camera like it's another character, as if they were making a film while not losing the theatrical elements. And both Bernadette and Mandy are they're like, yeah, no, the camera's here, and we are not intimidated by it whatsoever. And it's a recording... So, James Lapine directs like a graphic designer, which he also is. He directs like an artist, and he really directs like an artist in Sunday in the Park with George. And I think in the way that he directs it to be entirely framed by the frame of the painting lends itself so well to being framed by the actual frame of the camera. And so I think of it as sort of like a perfect marriage of a production, not just a show, but a production with that specific cast, that specific director, that specific set, with a medium. And I think that there's a reason that it has the moment it has in Tick, Tick, Boom. Is because Tick, Tick, Boom is also talking about this sort of layering. And we both see Jonathan Larson watching the pro shot, and then he lives it in his head in the Sunday sequence. And I think that's why Lin-Manuel Miranda makes the choice that he makes of blending that world, is because it really lends itself to that in-between sort of pushing at the boundaries of what is and what isn't.
It's funny that you bring up Tick, Tick, Boom, because as you were talking, I was just thinking about the moment when they're watching Sunday in the Park in Tick, Tick, Boom, and Jonathan Larson's best friend. Michael. Thank you. Michael says, and every Sondheim musical should be on PBS. And when I saw that at this, when I first watched Tick Tick, I burst out laughing, and then I started crying, and I was like, this movie needs to stop speaking to me on such a profound level.
I worked a talk back with Andrew Garfield on Tuesday with Tick Tick Boom.
At the 92
Yes, and I was surrounded by like high school age theater kids. I was literally sitting next to their drama teacher. They had the press corps on like one side of an aisle, and then next to me was the drama teacher. And first off, that line got a full round of cheers in there. So talk about like a new generation who wants more of this. It got not a standing ovation, but like an ovation. And Andrew then talked in the talk, which it will eventually be made public. So maybe by the time this is out in 90 seconds, I will have put this out for people to watch his answer. He talks about that Sunday sequence. And he talks about why Lynn does it the way it does, because the way that Jonathan wrote that song, it was never performed with full people. It was just Jonathan on his piano.
Yeah.
But Lynn made the choice to elevate it out and make it this full Sunday homage, and it's because of what I'm talking about here, of this sort of reaching across the barriers of what is and isn't possible. It's a fascinating thing, and if you ever decide to do just an episode on like movie musicals as a concept, I call the Tick Tick Boom episode, because I have so much to say about this film.
When Filmed Live Musicals expands into musicals on screen and we cover all musicals on screen, I promise you will be first up in line for Tick Tick Boom.
Yes, Tick Tick Boom and American in Paris. Those are my flags that I'm staking in the ground.
You got it. Okay, let us speed ahead to Sweeney Todd.
Yes.
Now, I'm aware of 7 different pro shots of Sweeney. There's the original, the National Tour, which is the Broadway production on tour, in 1982. The Royal National Theatre have a production on the BBC in 94. There's a Spanish, I don't know if it's Spanish language or if it's just a Spanish production in English from Barcelona that was on Spanish TV in 95. I believe it's
Spanish language, but I could be messing it up with another something.
I need to, that one is one I need to research. Upper North had one broadcast in 98 on the BBC. A New York City Center production with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra did a version of the New York City Center production with George Hearn and Patti LuPone, which was filmed in 2001. And then there's one at the Opera House. I'm not sure which Opera House. My notes are unclear. Which was aired on the BBC in 2003. And then most recently, and one of my favorite pro shots of all time, the New York Philharmonic concert version in 2014.
Yes, that is a good one. And then we also have the film. We also have the Helena Bonham Carter and Johnny Depp film. Yeah, no, Sweeney Todd, and I think the reason why it's taped so constantly, again, speaks to how influential that original production was, as we spoke about, where that original taping set off a firestorm. And I don't know why this is coming to mind, but I think about the way Steven Spielberg speaks about West Side Story and how he always wanted to film his own West Side Story because it inspired him so much. I think a lot of people want to make a pro shot of Sweeney Todd because the Sweeney Todd pro shot inspired them so much. And so they want to have their version committed to celluloid in the same way that one was. I think there's a lot of that happening, of sort of tradition begets tradition begets tradition.
Oh my goodness. This has been a speed through of the world of Sondheim's pro shots. And it took us 50 minutes, but it's still... we did our best.
I can talk for a while.
We both, oh my goodness, there's so much to say and so much we haven't said. There will be a blog post in connection with this episode where you can find links to watch most of these productions where they are legally available.
Yes.
I will caveat that. Where they are officially available, not in inverted commas. Margaret, thank you so much again for your time and for your expertise. I am so excited to dive into Pacific Overtures with you in 2 weeks.
I'm so ready. Give me all the Alvin Ing and Mako I can handle.
The Filmed Live Musicals podcast is created and edited by your host, Luisa Lyons, with thanks to our wonderful patrons, Josh Brandon, Belinda Broido, Elliot Charles, Jillian Dos Santos, Rachel Esteban, Mercedes Esteban Lyons, Rusty Fox, David Jones, James T. Lane, Alison Matthews, Al Monaco, David Negrin, Amy Penn, Jesse Rabinowitz and Brenda Goodman, David and Catherine Rabinowitz, Joe Tillotson, and Beck Twist for financially supporting the site. FilmedLiveMusicals.com is the most comprehensive list of filmed stage musicals. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you would like early access to this very podcast, early access to site content, the full weekly newsletter with info on upcoming streams, and exclusive access to the streaming calendar, become a Filmed Live Musicals patron for as little as $3 US a month. And if you're outside the US, you can sign up in your local currency. Visit FilmedLiveMusicals.com to learn more. If you like what you hear, please leave a review through the Rate This Podcast link in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thanks for listening.